What if I told you the most powerful engine in F1 history came from a family sedan? Formula One is supposed to be cutting-edge, futuristic, impossibly precise. So how did BMW take a 1.5-liter block from the 1960s and turn it into a turbocharged monster that made more horsepower than even today's V6 hybrids? This wasn't just an engine, it was a weapon. One that left rivals shaking, engineers stunned, and the FIA scrambling for the rulebook. This is the story of the BMW M12/13, the outlaw engine that dominated F1 and got itself banned in the process. BMW engineers didn't start with a blank sheet. They started with their M10 engine, originally designed in 1961 with 75 horsepower. That engine was reliable and flexible, and most importantly, it had potential. By the late 1970s, Formula One had started embracing turbocharging, and BMW saw an opening. They bored out the M10 block, slapped on a giant turbo, and introduced the M12/13. With KKK, Kuhnle, Kopp, and Koch turbochargers, intercoolers, and Bosch fuel injection, this thing became a ticking time bomb of speed. In the race trim, it made about 800 to 850 horsepower. But qualifying spec? Reports say it cracked 1400 to 1500 horsepower. No, that's not a typo. The dynos couldn't even measure it. BMW's engineers famously claimed the dyno maxed out before the engine did. Some said the power output was so high that the block would warp after a single lap. But that's all it needed. One blisteringly fast lap to lock in pole position. When BMW's ferocious M12/13 engine was finally ready to prove itself, it needed the right car. A chassis strong enough to handle the explosive power and fast enough to exploit it. That machine was the Brabham BT52, designed by the legendary Gordon Murray. Built for the 1983 F1 season, the BT52 was unlike anything else on the grid. It was a car born not just from performance needs, but from necessity, after ground effect aerodynamics were suddenly banned at the end of 1982. Murray had just a few weeks to redesign Brabham's entire chassis philosophy. The result? A slim, dart-shaped car with a unique weight distribution. 70% of the mass was shifted to the rear to maximize traction for the rear wheels, which were now being hammered by a turbocharged 1.5-liter engine producing up to 800 horsepower in race trim and over 1,200 in qualifying. The BT52 wasn't just a response to new rules, it was a surgical weapon built to dominate, and it worked. In the hands of Nelson Piquet, the BT52 powered by the BMW M12/13 engine won the 1983 Drivers' Championship, making it the first turbocharged car ever to do so. It didn't just race, it rewrote the rules. The BMW M12/13 engine was a marvel, yes, but it was also a maniac. Its staggering power came at a steep price: reliability. Especially in its most extreme configurations, this engine wasn't built to last. It was built to blow everyone else off the track, even if it only lasted a single lap to do it. In qualifying trim, teams pushed this 1.5-liter turbocharged engine to over 5.5 bar of boost, roughly 80 psi, producing a jaw-dropping 1400 to 1500 horsepower. That's nearly 1000 horsepower per liter, which is borderline absurd. The sheer violence of that power delivery often meant these engines would grenade themselves after a single flying lap. But that was fine, because pole position was the prize. BMW engineers reportedly didn't even know the true horsepower numbers. Their dyno maxed out at 1,280 horsepower, and the engine broke it. That's not a figure of speech, it physically broke the dyno. Race day trims were slightly less extreme, running lower boost levels to last a full Grand Prix. But slightly less still meant 800 to 900 horsepower. The stress on components was immense. Turbos overheated, pistons cracked, exhaust manifolds glowed like lava. Engine failures were a constant threat, and the Brabham BT52 chassis had to be meticulously designed to survive the heat, the torque, and the unpredictability of such power. And that's just the mechanical side. The turbo lag on the M12/13 was ferocious. Drivers would hit the throttle and then wait. Nothing. Then everything. The boost kicked in like a sledgehammer, and the rear tires had to take it all. Control became an art form, and small errors meant instant retirement. In short, the M12/13 was more weapon than engine. And like any weapon, it was dangerous not just to the competition, but to the one wielding it. It won championships, yes, but it also left a trail of exploded blocks, melted components, and shattered expectations in its wake. Eventually, the M12/13's overwhelming power forced the hand of the FIA. The issue wasn't just the engine's performance, it was the escalating war of power, cost, and danger. Other manufacturers joined the turbo arms race. Ferrari, Renault, Honda. By 1986, turbo engines in qualifying were pushing 1,400 to 1,500 horsepower, while race engines produced around 900 to 1,000 horsepower. FIA tried to tame the madness. First came fuel limits, then boost restrictions, capping boost at 4.0 bar, later 2.5. Teams found workarounds, of course, but the writing was on the wall. In 1989, F1 banned turbocharged engines altogether. BMW had already exited by then, pulling out in 1986. But their engine lived on under the rebadged name Megatron, used by the Arrows team. Even in its reborn form, the M12/13 remained an unholy alliance of raw power and imminent combustion. When a machine pushes boundaries the way the BMW M12/13 did, it stops being just an engine, it becomes a legend. And like any good legend, this one comes with its fair share of myth, mystery, and madness. The most infamous rumor? That BMW mechanics urinated on the engine blocks. Yes, seriously. The story goes that because the M12/13's iron blocks were seasoned over time, sitting outdoors for years to gain natural stability, BMW techs would christen the blocks with their own organic contribution before installation. Some say it was superstition. Others claim it was a nod to ancient metallurgy techniques, where urine was sometimes used in tempering processes. And a few believe it was just engineers having fun with the media. Whatever the truth, the legend stuck, and now it's part of M12/13 folklore. Then there was the dyno story. BMW engineers were so desperate to test the engine's power output that they ran it on a dyno that simply couldn't handle it. The result? The dyno broke, mechanically failed, because the power output exceeded its limits. This wasn't a joke. The engineers genuinely didn't know how much the engine was making. It was like trying to weigh a freight train with a kitchen scale. And of course, the madness wasn't just mechanical, it was cultural. The M12/13 represented a different era of F1. No limits, no fear, no guarantees. Drivers knew the car could explode beneath them. Teams knew they were walking a fine line between genius and disaster. But they did it anyway. Because for a few short years, this engine was Formula One's wild heart, raging, unpredictable, and completely unforgettable. These aren't just stories, they're proof that the M12/13 wasn't just an engine, it was a full-blown legend. To understand why the BMW M12/13 was feared, you have to imagine what it felt like to sit behind the wheel of a machine that was always on the verge of killing itself, and possibly taking you with it. This wasn't just another fast engine. It was raw, unpredictable, and pushed to mechanical extremes that even today seem borderline reckless. First, there was turbo lag, but not the kind you might feel in a road car. This was monumental. Drivers would press the throttle coming out of a corner and wait. A beat. Another beat. Then, boom! A violent, instantaneous surge of power that felt like the car was being catapulted. On slick tires and sketchy 1980s suspension, it made throttle control a high-wire act. A slight misstep and the car would spin, or worse, crash. Then there was the boost pressure. This little 1.5-liter inline-4 was being force-fed up to 5.5 bar, 80 psi of pressure, an absurd number even by today's standards. It turned a tiny engine into a ballistic missile, but it also put impossible strain on every component. Pistons, rods, crankshafts, turbos, everything. Nothing was safe. In qualifying mode, it was essentially a disposable bomb wrapped in carbon and wires. The drivers knew it too. The engines didn't whisper, they screamed. They hissed, rattled, and banged like they were barely contained. You weren't piloting a car, you were riding a mechanical tantrum. In qualifying trim, many engines were designed to last just a single lap, and that lap was pure violence. And because there was no traction control, no electronic safety nets, and very little in the way of crash protection by modern standards, mistakes weren't minor, they were catastrophic. So, what made it scary? Everything. The lag, the boost, the noise, the unpredictability, the fragility. The knowledge that the engine behind your head was tuned so close to the edge, it was basically daring physics to stop it. It wasn't just fast, it was unstable, unforgiving, and borderline insane. And that's why it wasn't just respected, it was feared. After the turbo ban, naturally aspirated engines returned. The era of screaming V10s and V12s took over, and the sport moved on. But the M12/13's influence never disappeared. BMW proved that unconventional thinking and brutal force could shatter expectations. Even today, engineers look back at that era with a mix of admiration and disbelief. It's hard to believe that an engine producing more horsepower than a modern-day F1 hybrid unit came from a base design over 2 decades old. And the fans? They still whisper about it. The M12/13 is F1 folklore, a monster forged not just in metal, but in myth. Could it ever come back? Short answer, no. The modern F1 ecosystem prioritizes sustainability, efficiency, and longevity. The M12/13 is the antithesis of that. It was brutal, fragile, explosive, and excessive in every way. But would fans want it back? In spirit, absolutely. The raw power, the unpredictability, the sheer madness of those turbo years, they represent something that feels missing today. The M12/13 wasn't just an engine, it was a rebellion on wheels, a machine that screamed defiance and torched expectations. It proved that even in the world's most elite motorsport, a little chaos can still make history. And that's the shocking truth. For more stories like these, subscribe to our channel. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. See you soon.